Hello, and welcome to another episode of Inside the World of Matt's Headroom. Let me just put this down here, and why don't you all get comfortable for a couple minutes? Because I want to give a presentation today that I've entitled Pedophilia for Dummies. And obviously, that's a takeoff on all those for dummy books, but I thought it was a catchy title. And but I do actually want to kind of give a relatively simple explanation for pedophilia. For those of you who haven't seen my show before, I'll have to repeat myself. I worked for about 30 years. I'm retired now as a therapist, and for all those 30 years, I was involved in some way or another in the treatment of sexual offenders of all different kinds, and also people that had all kinds of fetishes that had embroiled in their lives and was, wrecking their marriages and stuff like that. I am a previous member of the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker in Illinois. And like I said, I used to have my own sex offender treatment program that was called the Forensic Treatment Associates. So I just want to say that not to be braggadocious, but to tell you that I think I know what I'm talking about. And it's kind of interesting because, sometimes when you've been very actively involved in something, you can't always see the forest for the trees because you get so involved in, what you're doing that it's very hard. But I've been retired now for about 10 years. And, I have that's that old story. You can take Chicago, you can take the boy out of Chicago, but you can't take Chicago out of the boy. Well, it's the same thing when you're a sex offender therapist. Unfortunately, you might take me out of sex offender therapy, but you can't take it out of me because it was a piece of my life that I, dedicated an awful lot of time to. I wrote about it, I lectured about it, blah blah blah. But the reason I want to give this presentation is because you know there's so much pedophilia shit on YouTube. It's really amazing. And of course, I'm drawn to it, but I think I have a legitimate reason. But there's a lot of it. I mean, there's the pedophile poachers who I absolutely can't stand. I mean, there's all these things about Jeff Epstein. There's all this stuff about oh gosh, what's his name again now? The guy from Australia, Peter Scully. There's Surviving Life, which I like very much. Let's not think I'm saying anything negative about old Ron Swanson. But it's the YouTube is loaded. I mean, I wonder if you took the percentage of content. It's got to be around 20% at least. I think. I don't know. But anyway, I thought that there's a lot of things that come up about when you start talking about sex abuse, or for all that matters, serial murder, because I think they're in a similar category. Um, and that is like these kind of like cliche-ish questions, like, well, if you've been sexually abused, does that mean that you go on to be a sex offender? Um, you know, those kind of things. Or how much of a role does having been sexually abused, play into one becoming a sex offender? And then you hear about. I just watched this long thing about this guy BTK. What a moron! He was a serial killer, um, and he claims he wasn't abused at all. Um, and also, there's some complicating factors about even figuring out those variables because a lot of it's based on self-report of the criminal. You understand? So you get his version of it, unless you can trace back some records or something. But you don't really know, especially about their history. But I thought that I would try to just make it simple. There's that old expression, keep it simple. Well, not giving the 12-step movement any credit for that. I'm not a big fan of theirs. But anyway, um, I would like to try to explain, we'll call it pedophilia or sex offending, or, I mean, I guess we could even put in serial murder into this whole little explanation I want to give you. And like I said, I want to kind of keep it simple. So I thought I'd start by telling you a piece of research that I wish I could remember the exact piece of research, but I remember it was a really big, significant piece of research that it tried to answer the question of, this is all, by the way, boys that were studied. Okay, the whole question of, if you're sexually abused, do you go on to be a sex abuser? Well, I thought that this research was very interesting because actually what washed out of the research was the notion of what conditions does a sexually abused teenager go, not go on to be a sex abuser, or go on to be a sex abuser. Now, how valid and reliable that piece of research is, I can't, I wouldn't stake my life on. But as I would any piece of research, to be honest with you, if you know anything about halo effect or experimenter bias or anything like that. But I think it's interesting to give you the results of this piece of research, and then I'm going to interpret the inverse of that, which may answer at least part of the environmental aspect of people who go on to be sex offenders. Okay, so there were 4 categories that they outlined in this research that was, what they took a population of boys that had all been sexually abused, and then they tried to follow them longitudinally and see which ones turned out to be sex offenders and which one didn't. And then they analyzed these various factors. And here's the ones that washed out that were considered significant. Okay, that's all it means. They're considered significant. And that is, first of all, in a boy who was sexually abused, one of the factors that made it less possible or for him to go on to be a sex offender is just a very simple thing. And that was, were the authorities called? Were the authorities called? That was one of the most significant factors that seemed to determine or indicate who went on to be a sex abuser and who didn't. Were the authorities called? Or was it kept secret? Okay? The second one was, and this one I think is very, very interesting, which is, was the abuse accepted by the child's parents, or if not in his own family, by his, foster environment? Was it accepted? Because, one of the things, especially with incest, that's the one where it really gets outrageous. A lot of times, a little girl or a boy goes on to say either daddy or stepdaddy, it's usually that one, or paramour, abused me, and the mom gets very pissed and either doesn't believe the child, or gets very fragile and falls apart, and then that's kind of a no-no to talk about anymore, right? Or the offender gets pissed and then submerses the mother, who then sides with him against the child. That happens a lot in incest, believe me. And so, anyway, one of the other factor that came out of this was that if the abuse was accepted and empathized by the boy's parents, the child had a less likely inclination to become a sex offender in the future. Okay? The third one, this one I think is really interesting, was that I'll try to say it as straight as I can. Were therapy or social services offered? Not did they go to therapy? And, and not did social services have to be, heavily implemented for external controls. Just the fact of whether therapy and social services were offered to both that boy and his parents was another very significant indicator as to, or just variable, that happened to be more prevalent in if it was accepted, if therapy was offered, and if social services, became involved. It seemed like there was, again, it was a significant factor that those boys in those cases did not go on to be sex offenders. Okay, and then finally, there is the last one was the offender prosecuted in the judicial system? And if he was, then again, there was a less chance. Not even if he was found guilty or innocent. That's not the point in this study. It was that offender taken before a court of law and held accountable regardless of what the outcome was? Okay? So those are the 4 things. So, you could look at the inverse, which would say that, boys, if you took this study and turned it inside out, you could say basically that in cases where boys are abused and the authorities are not called, the abuse is antagonistically accepted by the parents, therapy or social services are not offered, and the abuse does not make it to the court system, that those boys have a greater chance of becoming sexual offenders. And I just thought that that's just a very interesting piece. It's always stuck with me in terms of trying to understand the social environment that can actually take an unfortunate incident and turn it into a problem for the victim as opposed to not a problem for the victim, meaning he goes on to offend himself. Now, that's one thing that I think, but those are social factors, right? Everything about that social, the court system, therapies and social services, the parents' acceptance of it, authorities being called, those are all social factors, okay? And you should just keep those things in mind. I think especially, in terms of harm reduction, if anybody's watching this and God forbid it happens to you, by all means, call the authorities, accept the abuse empathically and understandingly, make sure that therapy services are offered, or you make sure that the system gives it to you, and bust your ass to get that guy in court. Okay, that will help a real lot in whatever chance there might be that your son, in this case, because the study was only boys, could go on to be a sexual offender. Now, here's the embarrassing part, but this is the pedophile for what did I call this again? Pedophile for Dummies. And this is really for dummies because I'm a baby boomer, see? So, like, I don't edit my tapes. I don't put text in. And so I drew this cheesy diagram, and I'm going to try to frame it into the picture here, and we'll see if you can see it. But I want to explain this because I think it really does explain very clearly how people can become sexual offenders, okay? So let me try to get this in the picture first. Okay. If you can see there's at the top circle, there's the word genetics. And above that, I have biological put there. Oh, this is cheesy. I'm such a baby boomer. And then below that, on my left, there's a social factor, which is the presence of childhood physical or sexual abuse. Okay? And then there's a third variable that research has seemed to point out a great deal, which is a component in people who go on to be sexual offenders or like mass murderers and stuff. And that is just simply the exposure or witness to chronic violence, okay, usually in the home. But I don't think it necessarily has to be that. But it's just the exposure. Okay, it doesn't mean necessarily you have to be abused, but like if you have domestically violent parents who are constantly beating the shit out of each other, that's what this variable, this variable over here is all about. And these two here are social factors, but at the top we have genetics. And I'm going to try to hold this back a little bit and talk at the same time. If you look at this little diagram here I made, this genetic component is, I think, very important. And years ago, I would have said no, it's not. It's all, versus like the nature-nurture controversy. I would have said, no, it's all nurture. But I'm beginning to believe more and more as the internet starts to expose different forms of sex offending and stuff like that. Like I watched something now called the non-contact pedophile, who actually uses the internet to create hurtcore by just tormenting people and then asking them to take pictures of eating shit and stuff like that. That's disgusting. But anyway, genetics, I think, is a real important part. And the reason that I think genetics is so important is because it does explain the question. First of all, as you've heard me say many times before, Sigmund Freud said that when one forgets that man is still a member of the mammalian species, he loses a great understanding of human nature. Well, see, that means we're still animals, and so we have animal genetics. And some of us are less fortunate and some aren't, just like some people have genetics for cancer and some don't. There is this genetic, and it does, I think, explain why maybe nobody gets abused. I've heard Jeff Dahmer wasn't abused, for instance. And he went on to do hideous things. However, there's also this other variable. I'm doing this all backwards, so I look a little bit weird. But anyway, then there's this other one. Let's see here, which is childhood or physical or sexual abuse, and that does seem to be a component in a lot of people who go on to be sexual offenders. Yes, it is true that some people who have been sexually or physically abused, and notice I say physically abused too, because you see, sexual or physical, I don't think it really matters because it has more to do with aggression and the breaking of boundaries that creates someone who could be sexually abusive. Okay, so that's the this one over here. Oh, I can't do that. You have to look for yourself. And then finally, the last one, which is exposure or witness to chronic violence. It's a very interesting one because one, it says, mom and dad, behave yourselves. Don't be beating the shit out of yourselves in front of your kids. Don't beat your animals. You follow? And when you if you have all three of those factors, the genetic, you're abused physically or sexually, and you're exposed to chronic violence, you're going to be a sex offender for sure. Okay? I mean, I can almost guarantee it. But it's also important. Boy, I had another colored pen I was going to try to use, but I just can't get it together. But also, you have to realize that these things interact, but it doesn't mean that they all have to be present for one to become a sexual offender or a serial killer or something like that. Genetics could totally dictate it, and I'm believing that more and more and more. There's too many fucking pedophiles around for it just to be a socially produced problem. Okay, but I don't say that genetics causes it necessarily either. I mean, I don't know, but it's a very important factor. And then, depending on how intense the lower two circles are. Sorry about that. I had a little interference. Windows Update seemed to hog a whole bunch of space like it always does. Anyway, I'm going to try to get my mojo working again. So what I'm trying to say with this chart is that either any one of these factors alone can produce, pedophilia or sexual deviance. Perhaps that's a better word. But especially in combination with one another, it just increases the likelihood that one's going to become a sexual offender. So, like, the more sexually abused you are, coupled with perhaps some genetics, this is so hard to point, some kind of genetics that predetermine you to that would start to increase the likelihood of being that way. And then the same thing with exposure to violence, which don't underestimate. When a kid is exposed to violence, a lot of times that can be a factor unto itself, because if he starts to eroticize in some way the violence, then you can have a sexual offender that way too, with or without the genetics, with or without being abused or not. But it's these three factors that in an interactional fashion, just think of them as pulsating, like one may be a little stronger than the other, or they may be working in unison, very synergistically. But that's basically why people become sexually deviant. And I just thought I'd offer that to you as a way to make sense of all these YouTube videos, because it's so confusing. It can be so disarming. To be watching all this stuff and then wondering, oh my God, why is it? And was he sexually abused? Was he not? I think that diagram will spell it out for you pretty easily. And if you keep in mind the research that I mentioned, I think that will put into perspective at least the social aspects of what turns somebody sexually deviant and how to prevent it. And, again, God forbid something like this happens to anybody in your family or you're close to, call the authorities, caretakers or parents or whatever, please accept. They always say, believe the child. Well, you fucking should. That's stupid pedophilic rhetoric when they say, oh, kids lie. you know, or that whole group that was the false memory syndrome thing. When a kid comes up to you and says, gets the guts to come up to you and say, you know, daddy or the neighbor or whoever was tickling my titi, believe them. And get services, demand them from the system or get them yourself, but at least offer them. Like I said, the interesting point about that is that you don't have to necessarily complete therapy to resolve your sexual abuse to not become a sexual offender. You may need to go to therapy to resolve other issues it may create for you, but you don't necessarily have to go. It needs to be offered at the time of the offense to a child. Okay? And also, get those assholes into court. I don't care if they're your family member and they're pleading and crying and whatever, they need to get into court. If the system lets your child and you down, at least he knows that the judicial system has taken a position. When he's left alone, when he's left alone by his parents' emotional response, when he's left alone because the authorities aren't called, when he's left alone because services aren't offered, and when he's left alone because the person doesn't make it into the court system, it starts to increase the likelihood, according to the research I mentioned before, for adolescent boys who were sexually abused to go on to be sexual offenders. None of this is absolute. It's still a confusing topic, but I thought that I would try to clarify it a little bit, and maybe it'll help you enjoy these other videos a little more with some greater understanding. And thank you very much. And this has been another episode of Mack's Headroom. Namaste.